Dragnet, normally seen at this time, will be seen tomorrow night at 9:30. Now stay tuned for Florida Forum. WCKT News presents Florida Forum, a weekly examination of topics of interest to the people of South Florida. This week's guest on Florida Forum is novelist playwright James Baldwin. Now sitting in for the vacationing Don Fisher, here is your moderator, Tom Miller.
Good evening. National attention has been focused on the problems of the American Negro for the past several weeks. Major civil rights legislation from President Kennedy is now before Congress. Huge demonstrations have been held across the country. Violence has erupted in many places. Last week on Florida Forum, we discussed the racial situation with Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who tried unsuccessfully to bar the entrance of 2 Negro students to the University of Alabama. This week, we have invited author and playwright James Baldwin to express his views in this growing controversy. Mr. Baldwin is the best-selling author of several books that reflect on racial conflict. He has offered his intellectual and moral support to the cause of the American Negro. And tonight, he has interrupted his schedule in Puerto Rico, where he is writing a play to answer questions from our panel and studio audience. Questioning Mr. Baldwin tonight will be WCKT newsman Al Dempsey and Dr. Charlton Thibault, chairman of the History Department of the University of Miami. There will also be questions from our studio audience after this message. To begin tonight's program, we'll ask Mr. Baldwin to state briefly if he feels the racial conflict in Alabama and Mississippi could happen here in Florida.
Well, in my view, which is the view I think of most American Negroes, or their experience of most American Negroes, the situation in Alabama and Mississippi, which is spectacular and surprises the country, is nationwide. Not only could it happen in Florida, it could happen in New York or Chicago or Detroit or anywhere there's a significant Negro population. Because until today, all of the Negroes in this country, in one way or another, in different fashions, north or south, are kept in what is in effect prison. In the north, one lives in ghettos, and in the south, the situation is so intolerable as to become sinister, not only for Mississippi, or for Alabama, or for Florida, but for the whole future of this country. White people are surprised, I think, at the vehemence of Negro feeling and the depth of the danger. But I don't think it has caught any Negro by surprise. One has been in a terrible situation for a very, very long time.
Now to our panel, Mr. Dempsey.
Well, why could it happen? Why does it have to be violence? Why can't it be something other than violence?
Well, and part of the reason, one is doing one's best to avoid violence, but one of the reasons that it could happen that way is because for so long, for 100 years, the American Republic in general has ignored and denied the whole situation that Negroes have operated within. To be a source of cheap labor, for example, north or south, is to be, in effect, oppressed. Now, the oppression is bad enough, but the myth that the country is created about the object of the oppression, the myth about the Negro being happy in his place, is something the Republic has managed to believe. And so that in addition to the fact of oppression, one has also the fact that within the country for 100 years there's been a way of life occurring in the country which most of the country knows nothing about. And this is reflected, for example, in the way Negroes talk to each other. It's a kind of language which does not really exist on what we like to think of as a major level of the American culture.
Right, but hasn't there been a lethargy on the part of the American Negro for that 100-year period, too, along with the white supremacy attitude?
I don't think so, no. I think that's, again, part of the myth. One's got to remember, after all, this may sound very rude, but you got to remember who wrote the history books and toward what end. I have never known a lethargic Negro. I've known a great many demoralized Negroes, but that is not the same thing. The truth is, the Negroes have been fighting for this 100 years to obtain their rights, but and the country has ignored it. And the technique of the country has mainly been to accommodate it or to contain it, but never really to change the situation. And what has happened in our time, in these last few years, is that it's no longer possible to contain it. And the technique of accommodation has broken down. For the first time, really, the situation is now in the open, and no American can ignore it, as has been true up until, let us say, 1954.
All right, well, why did it happen? Why do you think it happened? in 1954?
Well, for one thing, what happened in the South is that when the Supreme Court desegregated schools, or tried to desegregate schools, the South, which until that time had really ignored pleas on the part of the NAACP or responsible Negro leaders to do something about creating a situation in the South. They were not asking for the end of desegregation, but to honor the separate but equal clause. And the schools in the South were not equal. Now, this meant, after 54, that the South, which had ignored the necessities on the part of Negroes to be educated, suddenly leapt into that breach and started building schools for Negroes to keep the schools segregated. And this meant, in effect, that if I were a college president in the Deep South at a state college, that I had lost my position. I could no longer bargain. I no longer had to go to the governor to get a new dormitory or a new chemistry lab. The governor was all too anxious to give me a new chemistry lab. That meant that I had no longer any effect, no power whatever. I couldn't guarantee the docility of my students. The bargaining table had suddenly disappeared. This is what really happened, I think.
Well, that was 1954. This is 1963. All of a sudden we have violence. That's what we're talking about here. Are Negro leaders, and let's consider you one of the Negro leaders, are Negro leaders encouraging conditions of violence?
No responsible Negro leader can possibly. All the people I work with and know are working as hard as they know how to channelize an energy which they know is there in order for it not to become violence. But to be candid, there is something amazing, really, in the fact that it is not, that Negroes have not been violent sooner. No. There is something very impressive, in my view, in the ways in which Negroes have managed to deal with this situation. And the kind of discipline, the interior discipline demanded of an adolescent to sit in and to boycott and to undergo all the things one's got to go and undergo is an extraordinary thing. And if it were true that this was a new Negro, that he'd never been seen before, that would be a miracle. And what has really happened is that these people have been coming a long, long time. And in the 30s, for example, when people like Roy Wilkins were in the South as hobos, trying to organize unions, and being beaten and clubbed and murdered, the Republic ignored all this. But every Negro child growing up knew something about it. It is a Republic, I repeat, that has been captured by its own myth of the subservient Negro. And now is surprised to discover that the myth was never true.
Dr. Tebow.
Mr. Baldwin, are you saying that you think possibly if separate but equal facilities had been provided for Negroes that none of this might have happened?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
I didn't think you meant to.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that. But I did mean to suggest that the NAACP at that point was not at that point trying to change a law, really, but doing what Negro leaders are always trying to do, which is try to save the children, to invest the children with morale. And you can't teach a child if the situation in which he's studying is intolerable. And we all know that. Now, it is also true that you cannot really, no Negro child who's going to a segregated school, which may have cost millions of dollars, is fooled about why he's there. He's there because white people want him there and no place else. And that is, you cannot educate a child in that context either. Do you see?
It seems to me also that while you are asking white people to change their estimate of the Negro, to raise their estimate of the Negro, you are also saying to the Negro that he ought to do something to raise his estimate of himself. Isn't that true?
Well, it's one of the great problems, let me put it this way, of being an American Negro in the first place, that you are taught, really, the entire weight of the Republic teaches you to despise yourself. All the standards you look, when you open your eyes in the world and you look out at it, there is nothing reflecting you. As far as we can tell, for example, from television programs, there are no Negroes in the country at all, or from most Hollywood productions. The country has arbitrarily declared that kinky hair and dark skin, wide nose, and big lips is a hideous thing to be afflicted with. Now, the Negro parent, in this case, I say I'm the Negro parent, has to use everything he can find to counteract the Republic's attempt to diminish this child. It is inevitable, then, that by the time a boy becomes 20 or a girl becomes 20, they are in great battle inside to release themselves from what the country calls them. You see? Now, this estimate of oneself is a very difficult thing, to change. But this is part of the battle. One has got to do that. And incidentally, or by no means incidentally, I think that white Americans have misunderstood something else. They seem to assume that I live in a segregated society. And they don't realize that they live in a segregated society, that we do, and that the white child is really just as victimized by this peculiar medieval system as any Negro child. And what is worse for the white child doesn't know it. And his whole attitude toward the world and toward reality is very romantic.
If I may add one more question, why are you as doubtful as you are about what liberals are going to do for the cause of the Negro?
Well, because I don't mean to sound cruel, and there are exceptions, but in general, my experience of liberals, they have attitudes, and they have all the proper attitudes, but they have no real convictions. And when the chips are down, and you expect them to deliver on what you thought they felt, they somehow are not there.
Is that your estimate of the Kennedy administration to some extent?
Well, my estimate of the Kennedy administration, part of my estimate of the Kennedy administration is that, first of all, the Kennedy brothers, like almost all other white Americans, even with the best will in the world, know very little. In fact, I would hazard until recently virtually nothing about what we like to call the Negro problem. You know, most of the white Americans I've ever encountered, really, you know, had a Negro friend or a Negro maid or somebody in high school, but they never, you know, or rarely, after school was over or whatever, you know, came to my kitchen. You know, we were segregated from the schoolhouse door. Therefore, he doesn't know. He really does not know what it was like for me to leave my house, you know, leave the school and go back to Harlem. He doesn't know how Negroes live. And it comes as a great surprise to the Kennedy brothers and to everybody else in the country. I'm certain, again, you know, that, like most white Americans I have, you know, encountered, they have no, I'm sure they have nothing whatever against Negroes. That's really not the question. You know, the question is really a kind of apathy and ignorance, which is a price to be paid for segregation. That's what segregation means. You don't know what's happening on the other side of the wall because you don't want to know.
Mr. Baldwin, I'm going to have to interrupt here for just a moment. We'll be back with more questions after this message. Now we'll have questions from our studio audience. I'd like to remind you to wait for recognition, then stand and state your name and affiliation. First of all, we have a gentleman in the third row on the end. That's right.
My name is Dr. George Simpson. I'm the Vice President of the local NAACP campus. I would like to know your impression of this, perhaps. I lived in Mississippi for a while, and I personally, having lived there for a year, I'm surprised at the action taken by these people who 10 years ago would have been terrified to act in concert as they do. It seems that Negroes all over the country now are no longer afraid of personal injury in these things. How do you evaluate this, or what do you think caused this?
That's a hard question for me to answer because I don't know the South that well. I've been to Mississippi, but I've never really lived there. But I should suppose that in the very same way that, on the very same principle, that even Southern white segregationists, what we call the poor white, is dimly aware, because of television, because of newspapers, of a world breaking in on the world which seemed so safe before, is being threatened by a larger world, which he doesn't understand. Now, in the case of Negroes, who I think have always lived somewhat closer to the realities than most white Americans seem to have lived, I think the impact of things like Africa, I think the impact of Martin Luther King in Montgomery, the impact of the awareness that there were some things Negroes could do for themselves, began to change the climate, the tenor, you know, the relationship the Negroes had to each other in such a place as Jackson, Mississippi, for example. After all, there's been a great deal, you live there, so you know there's been a great deal of groundwork going on among the people representing the NAACP and the students, you know. So that it was inevitable, in my view, that one day these people would ally themselves with a movement which they know to be, after all, in one way or another, irresistible, you know. I don't know if that answers you at all, but that's my suspicion.
In the back row, there's a lady, second in.
I'm Mrs. Maurice Serrata. Too many organizations to name. This is a local question and something that I realize you don't know all about at this point, but I think it points up some of the problems. This week, a colored delegation spoke to the Dade County Commission requesting that they modify and change in some way the civil service rules so that more colored people could get county jobs in a broader area of employment. The rules now say they have to take examinations. Only the top 4 can even be considered, and one of those will be chosen. The county commission voted that anybody who makes the top 4 and is colored and is passed over, if they want to hear about it, they'll fix it up. But that's all they did. They also have a human relations committee supposed to help with problems like that. What else could they have done, or should they have done?
It's almost, how can I answer that? It is really a local question. I would like to know more about the, how can I put it, the motives of the people you're talking about. On the face of it, it occurs to me, it seems to me to be merely another way of seeming to correct the situation without doing anything to change it. Now, maybe being unjust, to the people in charge of this local problem, but on the basis of my experience, it seems to me like the most incredible immoral pussyfooting, and at this point in our history, we can't afford it.
In the second row, there's a lady in a black dress.
I'm Lila Powell, resident of Miami, attending the workshop in American Studies at the University of Miami. Mr. Baldwin, inasmuch as you are one of the outstanding writers of our era, I would like to ask you what you think of the role of the Negro in American literature today.
Today? The role of the American Negro, before we get up to, before we talk about today, has been, to overstate it a little bit, but not really very much, has been mainly, it seems to me, to corroborate the American fantasy. And this is even true in the case of a very great novelist, I think, Faulkner, for example, whose Negroes, though they're handled with a great deal of delicacy, exist mainly for the comfort of whites. For example, Dilsey in Sound and Fury, whose role in that book is to save that family. And you never get any suspicion, if I remember the book correctly, that Dilsey has other relations, like to her husband or to her children, She is in that book because the Compton family is doomed and only Dilsey can save her. It's an interesting idea. I sort of resent it. As for the role of the American Negro in literature today, it's too early to talk about it, because what's happening, I think, again to overstate it, but not very much, is for the first time in American history, in the history of American literature, I, speaking now as a Negro, have been described by you for hundreds of years, and now I can describe you. And that's part of the panic.
The gentleman in the back row.
My name is Robert Zuckerman. I'm a teacher, and I consider myself one of the embattled intellectuals in this community. I'd like to ask Mr. Baldwin whether the black Muslims have made any strong inroads among the Negro intellectual community in this country.
Again, a question which one has to answer in many ways. I can't do entire justice to it. I know the black Muslim movement has made tremendous inroads, or can be called, really, perhaps, almost the only grassroots movement. I mean, among urban Negroes, the sympathy for the Muslim movement is enormous. You asked about the inroads among intellectuals. That's harder to answer because one's got to include in that lawyers, students, people like myself, actors, musicians, and there it's harder to tell. But there, I can put it this way, that it's almost impossible to be an American Negro and not have, on some level, a kind of emotional identification with the black Muslim movement. Now, having said that, I also feel that, speaking for myself, that it is one thing for me to teach my child to be proud of being black, because he should be proud of it. But another thing for me to teach him that he's better because he's black. Because that recipe has always ended up in moral chaos and worse than that. Do you see what I mean? But it's a very important movement, and the only way it can be defeated is for the country to eliminate the situation which produced it.
The lady in the back row in the end.
My name is Cecilia Jones, and I would like to ask Mr. Baldwin, as a writer, what do you consider your greatest inspiration?
That's both easy and hard to answer. I could answer it one way by saying it's my nieces and my nephews. In a certain way I write. I don't want them to be ashamed of me. I know a great many of my white critics would not be able to tell if I were lying, but they would. Does that answer you?
Let's return now to our panel. Mr. Dempsey.
Mr. Baldwin, as far as inspiration goes, what about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and things like that? What inspiration do you get from aligning yourself with these groups?
The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, for example. Well, if you want to, it's a can of beans. Let's open it. I was appalled by two things. I still am. By the press attitude of the Cuban Revolution shortly after Castro had expropriated, American property. I also felt, now speaking as a Negro, I'm speaking for myself, as a member of no organization. I also felt that we, the American government, the administration in power at that time, made a terrible mistake in dealing with Castro. Because the Cubans, no matter what the press says, have a right to their land. It was a revolution which came from the bottom. And it is very dangerous to try to oppose that kind of revolution. And from my point of view, we gave that island as a gift to the Russians.
Right, but you're also an American. From your point of view, isn't Cuba a threat to our country here?
Well, speaking as an American Negro, it depends on which country you mean. You got to remember that the country which white Americans have boasted so long is a country I have never seen. And now speaking not only for myself, but speaking as a family man, it would be very hard for me to know exactly what to say to my nephew, for example, if he were going to go into the army. It would be very hard for me to invest him with any morale to persuade him that there was some overwhelming reason he should go to Cuba, to free Cuba, in defense of a government which couldn't free him. And in any case, no matter what I said, this is a question you have to be a fool not to think about. And from that point of view, again, it seems to me we made a very great error. When Castro and Khrushchev went to Harlem, it's our fault. They went to Harlem because Harlem is there. And as long as Harlem is there, we are in danger no matter what we say, no matter what kind of rhetoric we use to cover to deny the disaffection and the very dangerous despair of 22 million people.
Dr. Thibault.
You have tried expatriation, and you have undoubtedly examined communism as a solution of these problems, and you have seen other Negro intellectuals like Du Bois go communist, and yet you reiterate from time to time that you are American, that there's more potential here than there is anywhere else. Would you like to comment on how you arrived at this position and just what you mean by it?
Well, in the first place, speaking only of my own experience, with communism when I was in high school and in my teens, I was never very attracted to it for a very simple reason. Too many politicians had promised, too many American politicians, I mean, had promised too much. And the communists promised the moon. So I distrusted them on that basis. And my experience with them, trying to work with the Stalinists, was so disastrous that I never really understood why anybody assumed that the bulk of the Negro population would be attracted to communism. But when I say I'm an American, it's something I discovered when I was abroad, because I got off the boat in France. No matter what I thought of myself as being, all I was then was an American. I wasn't anything else. You couldn't call me anything else. And this led to a kind of examination of what I take to be the real energy of this country, in which oddly enough, I really believe in it. And when I say that the potential here is greater than anywhere else in the world, I mean that in the revolution that is occurring here now is unprecedented in my mind in the history of the world, because it's a revolution...
Baldwin, I'm sorry to have to interrupt the questioning here. We'll be right back after this message of interest. Tonight's guest has been James Baldwin, author and playwright. Mr. Baldwin, thank you for leaving your busy writing schedule in Puerto Rico to be with us tonight. Now for our panel, WCKT newsman Al Dempsey and Dr. Charlton Thibault of the University of Miami's Department of History, and for our distinguished audience. Until next week, this is Tom Miller saying good night from Florida Forum.
Florida Forum is a weekly discussion program of current affairs. Next week, Florida Forum will examine another topic of interest to the people of South Florida. Our guest will be Luis Somoza, former president of Nicaragua, who has charged that communism will control a large portion of Latin America within 10 years. Mr. Somoza, who is extremely influential in Nicaraguan affairs, will be interrogated on his recent trip to Washington. Members of our viewing audience are invited to participate in our programs. Tickets for next week's program and future programs may be obtained by writing Florida Forum, WCKT, Miami 38. That's Florida Forum, WCKT, Miami 38. Florida Forum is a presentation of WCKT News. This program was pre-recorded.